from the Cyber Hub bunker and studio. You're listening to the CISO Talk Podcast. No sales, no bullshit, just straight talk. Straight talk. And now for your host and CISO, James Azar.
Well, we're live. Charity, what's up?
Hey, I love your intro. That's so fun.
Thank you. I made it myself. I take all the credit. I made it myself. Literally made it myself.
Talented.
Yes, it's one of my many skills beyond just the cybersecurity folks. Folks, Charity Wright is a counter threat intelligence person, a cyber threat intelligence. What am I doing? Why did I say counter? Why did I say counter?
Counter works too. We counter.
But you're a threat intelligence expert. If you guys have not seen Charity on my show before, you got to go check it out. We've done so many awesome shows together. But today we're talking about China and the digital Silk Road, a new report that the company you work for, Recorded Future, just released that I found so interesting. I was like, there's no way we can't bring this up.
Thank you. I appreciate that. It was many months of research, and I'm just really excited to be here to chat about it.
I'm super excited about it. Bonjour to Nate. Bonjour. I guess we're moving to French today. So bonjour, comment ça va? Comment allez-vous? Je m'appelle James. Merci beaucoup. And that's about the extent of my French right there. But thank you everyone for tuning in. We're live on LinkedIn, Facebook, and YouTube. If you have not subscribed to the podcast, please make sure to do so right now, and make sure to follow myself. And Charity is tagged in all of these posts and in the show notes. So make sure you follow Charity. She's always dropping some gems. Charity, if you don't mind, just share briefly with our audience a little bit of your background and what you do at Recorded Future and why this specific report on China.
Yeah, sure. I started my career in the U.S. Army. I worked at the National Security Agency for a few years as an intelligence analyst and a Chinese linguist. So my background is focused on China, especially related to military intel and now cyber intel. I've worked for many, corporations over the past 6-7 years doing cyber threat intelligence. And now I get to work at Recorded Future with the Infosec Group, which is our research arm. And I focus on China, strategic intelligence, but also we counter disinformation. So we're out there, discovering influence operations and identifying what China is doing, what they're trying to say and convince everybody of around the world.
Yeah, you and I have had plenty of conversations around this, kind of independently and otherwise. But I'm very excited because when you sent me this report last week, I was like, when can you come on the show? Right? Like I was just like, let's do this now. No one understands, I think, more about the Chinese influence globally than you with the work you've done. I think, and this report really does highlight it. I'll just give a few shout outs here. Harshil and Matt, good morning. Thank you for being here. Everyone on YouTube, Facebook, if you got questions, bring them on, ask away as we go through this together. We'll be taking your questions and so forth and kind of addressing it. Let's talk about the Digital Silk Road Initiative, because I think that's something that people know Silk Road 2.0, right? Kind of the new movement. And now with the Afghanistan withdrawal, and we're not going to get political, by the way, folks. This is not a political discussion. This is a purely technical discussion around what they're doing and their ambitions. So just I want to lay that preface before we get really deep into this, so I don't have to come back and say we don't want to get into the politics of it. We want to get into the technical discussion and really the strategic discussion around it. And there's obviously, for everything, there's a political aspect to it, but we're going to try to stick to the digital piece of it. When we look at the Digital Silk Road, not a lot of people have heard about it. It's fairly new compared to most Chinese plans. Tell us a little bit about the Digital Silk Road.
Yeah, so China has this Belt and Road initiative. It's basically a global infrastructure project where they're, helping various countries around the world with different infrastructure, everything from physical infrastructure to digital. And the Digital Silk Road is kind of a nickname for the digital projects underneath the Belt and Road Initiative. So we're talking about, laying underwater and underground cable, 5G, satellite technology, setting up, servers, all different kinds of digital technology. And a lot of it, the digital Silk Road, a lot of the emphasis and the sales that are happening in some of the least developed areas of the world. So we're talking about Africa, Latin America, South Asia, areas that have kind of been left out by some of the big tech companies in Western nations. Maybe they didn't see an incentive to build there, or they couldn't, maybe those countries couldn't afford the technology packages that they needed for connectivity. And China is stepping in to fill those gaps, oftentimes accompanied by very large China state-backed loans so that they can afford to set up that infrastructure.
Yeah, it's essentially China's expansion of putting its workforce out too, by the way. So when they're giving out these loans, these aren't local jobs. They're not hiring Kenyans to build something in Kenya. They're importing Chinese workers to those countries to do the work.
Oftentimes, yes. So we're talking about very large tech companies out of China. Most of them are what they call their tech champions, like Huawei, ZTE, CloudWalk, some of the big names that most Americans are familiar with too. Now, when Huawei sends their teams over to start building out the infrastructure and building this technology, they often send teams to train people in country how to use that technology. So if they're, setting up, huge buildings full of servers, and they're teaching the employees there how to manage that infrastructure as well, using Huawei employees.
There's a few things within the Digital Silk Road and the Belt and Road Initiative that I think are very important to point out. One is China does not play by the same rules as everyone else plays on. They're very much into paying bribes in order to get some of this stuff done, passed, and signed on so that they can move on with their initiatives. But one of the things that I found very fascinating in the report when I was reading it, it wasn't very new for me, but it did get me thinking, and maybe you can shed some light to it, is they're discounting technology in order to gain access to user data, specifically around facial biometric intelligence. Where do you think that's going and why?
Yeah, well, they're offering discounted technology to make it maybe more affordable for these regimes and nations that otherwise couldn't afford it. But like I said, there are also several of these countries that are accepting these contracts, are also accepting very large loans that possibly they can't really afford. That's called debt trap diplomacy. And I think that's, a central theme that we see throughout many of these contracts, which is concerning in its own right, but that's not even something that we really focus on. In this particular report, there are several main concerns that we bring up. And like you said, one of them is around the use of surveillance technology. And another is China's access to data through building out this infrastructure all over the world. So this research really started with some high-level questions that I had around some of the research and reading I was doing. And it started with, what happens when China sends their big technology companies all over the world to establish, and install their technology in these countries, thereby giving them a foothold, possibly for espionage? That's where the research started. And what we found were many different case studies. I only included 8 in this report because I had to limit it. But there were 8 different case studies where China had abused the privileges and their powers in those countries to, one, collect data, unauthorized, or that they had not explicitly disclosed they were going to collect, just siphoning data, like the African Union, for one example. China had gifted a headquarters building to the African Union. And 5 years later, after all of the technology and internet was installed, there was somebody on staff at that location that discovered there were tons of data just being siphoned out straight to a server in Shanghai. Obviously, that incident was addressed immediately. Access was cut off. The employees that, from China that did have access to those servers were eventually let go, and they stood up their own security operations center to address that. One of the other very concerning things is that China has been, exporting surveillance technology through these big tech companies to illiberal regimes around the world. So dictators and authoritarians. And not only are they selling this technology to them, which is a concern, but it's not necessarily a threat, they're also sending employees over to teach them how to use it to monitor groups and populations of people within their country, the way that China is doing in their own country.
Yeah. Can I start by saying that's not borderline, that's dictatorship, but a lot of these regimes don't really know what they're signing up for, right? A lot of this is done through almost the kind of what I like to call the 100-year China policy, where we're all about China and we don't want to interfere with foreign affairs, and they kind of try to make it seem like they don't meddle in external foreign affairs, yet these loans are predatory in nature. These people can't pay. Some of these countries will never be able to pay back the amount of money they've borrowed from China, and end up almost being selling critical infrastructure and information to China in order to pay off these loans.
Exactly.
And one of the things I looked at was, you talked about the use of technology to maybe dictators and people who misuse it. Is when China sells that to dictators, are they, and I didn't see this in your report, so this is more of a curiosity question, right? Are they also kind of negotiating the access to that data as well? Meaning, hey, Mr. Dictator, here's all the surveillance technology. By the way, we want access to some of this data as well, because we want to look at it, or we have our own intentions with it.
That's a really good question. So what I found through my research is that sometimes they do explicitly discuss, hey, we're providing this surveillance technology for a safe city or a smart city. In trade, like let's say we're working in Africa, in trade, they ask for, we would like the data to come back to us so we can then improve how this technology works on dark-skinned individuals, which is known to be a specific problem with surveillance technology. It works better on light-skinned individuals and differentiates facial features better than on dark-skinned individuals. Now, when I read this, the alarms were going off. This is very concerning for many reasons. One, we know in the United States the problems that we've had, with racial issues, discrimination, targeting of Black Americans. So when I read about this happening in Africa, my immediate thought was China wants this information so that they can hone the technology. Now that can be used for good or for bad, but knowing the reputation that China has for discrimination against minorities and religious minorities, I'm very concerned about the risks. The risks being it could be used to target groups of minorities. It can be used to target political dissidents. And so differentiating dark-skinned faces really does create some very real risks for people and citizens in those countries, especially knowing that their government is already cracking down on, anti-government protests, the protests that are, pro-democracy. They're cracking down on those, and they can use this technology to target those protesters the same way China is doing in Hong Kong.
Yeah. The Hong Kong story is I think, we won't have time to get to Hong Kong today because no one wants me to unload on Hong Kong today. It's Friday. All right. We're going to go easy today. We're going to go fact. We're going to stick to the tech.
We're going to. This report is super heavy, but yes.
Yeah. This report, I'll tell you a few things with the report that I found to be very almost a bit concerning from a travel perspective as an American, right? Like, I've got to now consider what countries I go to and really do my research, and then create a different risk posture for different countries I want to travel to in the future. Because if China's really leading that infrastructure, that may be a place where I travel to in the same way I would, I'm not allowed in China anymore. But if I was, I go to China with a burner phone and the clothes on my back. I don't even take luggage. Take a backpack. I buy clothes in China. And the clothes I wear is what I leave with, and everything I wear in China is bought in China and stays in China. That's just my policy, right?
Sounds like a smart policy.
And a burner phone. I throw away the phone when I'm at the airport in China. It doesn't even make it on the plane with me. I'm the only guy on the airplane who's actually watching airline movies.
Yeah, it does create some very real risks for individuals. Now, of course, this report, the recorded future audience tends to be professionals that work in information security. So I really tried to make it very clear what the risks are for businesses as well, because it's a very strategic intelligence report. It's very high level. When I was writing this, G7 was also having a meeting discussing how to deal with Chinese competition. So it does address those very high level groups. But as an individual, yes, I would consider, who owns the infrastructure for all of the internet in a certain country. If you're traveling to Latin America, Africa, or South Asia, you may want to just Google it real quick and find out. If it is a Chinese tech champion like Huawei, ZTE, or CloudWalk, you may want to research even further what is the smart city or safe city situation in this country. Not so that you will have to avoid the country altogether, but so you can prepare yourself and do a really good risk, assessment for yourself. Like, do I need to take a burner laptop and phone? Am I safe to communicate with coworkers and family? And, just looking at preparing yourself for how much surveillance will I be under when I'm there?
So, you started talking about the facial recognition technology, kind of their desire to study, darker skinned individuals in Africa to perfect that technology. We know the issues, and you brought them up, that are well documented in the US, right? We know that facial recognition technology in African Americans is only about 60 to 70% accurate. Mm-hmm. In most cases, there's been people who've been charged, found guilty because of that technology. Yeah. And have had to do time in prison only to have that overturned later, thanks to good research and someone actually giving a damn, unfortunately. And so China getting access to biometrics seems to be almost, I think China, and I'm speaking in theory here, Charity. So if I'm out of line, just push me back in and I'll get back in the lane. But one of the things I've talked about, and even yesterday on the CISO talk I did with Alejandro Orellano, who's the CISO over at Microvest Capital Management, we were talking a little bit about biometrics. And I said, listen, my concern with biometrics is a lot of people think that biometric technology works by scanning your face, matching it with a scan, and that's it. And they don't understand that there's a mathematical formula and an algorithm behind it. And if China is able to master that algorithm across all different people on Earth, and we know that they do that in Asia, we know that the reason they don't care about it is because they've got that down in Asia. They know how to differentiate a facial recognition technology from a Chinese to a Korean to a Japanese to a Thai to Filipinos to et cetera, but they can't get it done in Africa. Is as the world moves more towards biometric authentication, right? Like what we see on our iPhones and with Windows Hello being deployed within networks. If really the idea behind this is gather as much data as possible so that we can really start breaking down facial recognition algorithms in order to really authenticate and get access into trusted systems. Because that's something I don't discount the Chinese thinking about. Their 100-year plan clearly is a well thought of plan.
Absolutely. They're very long-term planners. They're very strategic in their objectives. And like, if we even zoom out even more and look at just the sheer volume of data they have on humans all over the world, whether it was stolen through espionage campaigns or whether they're collecting, DNA data from DNA collection companies like Ancestry or whoever they've breached. They have this full dossier on so many human beings. And I think using that in the future toward machine learning, robotics. And it really does have a lot to do with, the control and utilization of humans all over the world. Very big
Indeed.
picture.
Larry says he's thinking about Blade Runner.
Yeah.
And Matt says that is epic, James. I think he's talking about my China regime of burner phone, burner clothes. I go in and I leave with the same pair of clothes I put on. It's actually very weird. And by the way, you throw off airport security for sure.
Yeah.
Because one thing I did learn about Chinese airport security is they really do look at your picture coming in and your picture going out. And if you're wearing the same exact thing, they freak out. They go, why is he wearing the same exact thing? Did he not have any clothes? Is that the same backpack? Is he carrying the same backpack?
He's homeless.
Yeah, is he homeless? Or is he, something else? You brought up 8 different case studies. And I think the one that I found to be more fascinating is we often hear about China's move into Africa. But Latin America surprised me. What is the strategy that you saw in your research on Latin America? And how are they trying to really take advantage of Latin America? Because that's our backyard, right? Latin America is, we share a land connection to Latin America. There's no other way around it.
Yeah, I think one of the misconceptions a lot of people have about the Belt and Road Initiative is that it's strictly economic and it's not state sponsored. Well, we actually have some evidence that, the majority of these tech giant companies out of China have significant state backing, and they have been using this technology and these projects for influence in those regions. And what we're seeing is China creating alliances with like-minded leaders. So let's say Brazil or Uruguay, for example. There are several others that we looked at. They have Huawei has built out 5G in Brazil, has built, Xi Jinping has built a very strong relationship with the leadership in Brazil, and they have a very tight connection there. And they're really just trying to take a little foothold, have some foothold in the Latin American region, kind of push the U.S. out of those relationships. In other countries, they have built political alliances. They have made deals with some of the leaders that, hey, we're going to provide this infrastructure package, but we need your political support, that China and Taiwan are one nation. So the one China policy, they have been pushing that political agenda on many of the leaders in Latin America. And then a follow-on is what we discovered was there's also a significant influence operation presence of China in that region. So influencing the media, influencing an anti-US sentiment, and influencing them for a pro-China view of, hey, nothing bad is happening in Xinjiang. Hong Kong is our business. Let's agree that we're going to stay out of each other's business politically, and you're not going to get involved in what we're doing there.
Can I say that seems Hitler-esque, almost in theory?
Yes.
We don't have Mein Kampf written by Xi Jinping, but we sure as hell have seen his 100-year plan for China. We know his Belt and Road Initiative. There's been a lot of talks of his that have been released recently talking about, his influence. I think COVID empowered a lot of different Chinese whistleblowers to come forward and really share a lot of information. So, there's some really stuff that's very scary there. But let's talk about how they're utilizing AI, because they're really using AI, and they're really trying to really create, the report. You were very awesome in the report, kind of in the writing and some of the stuff that you put in there. But they're exporting very intrusive AI technologies. They're giving that to all kinds of different regimes across the world, whether it be in Africa, Southeast Asia, and everything else. And they're really trying to see how AI could possibly become a suppressing aspect, the suppressing piece of technology going forward. What did your report find on that?
Yes. Well, you have to understand, at Recorded Future, we have a very diverse group of researchers and analysts. Some are a little more friendly to how China is attempting to rise. And then there are those of us that came from a military background or a little bit more hardline on China and what their intentions are. So we try to stay open-minded. We check each other's bias. And really what we discovered is there are some major security risks and privacy concerns, human rights concerns involved with how they're pushing and selling surveillance technology to these illiberal regimes. We have seen a decline in democracy around the world for the past 20 years. And during the COVID pandemic, it was a sharp decline. Much tighter restrictions on people's privacy, much tighter restrictions on protests in the streets. And so the pro-democracy movements in many of these countries have suffered as a result of surveillance technology being put in the hands of these dictators and authoritarian leaders by the Chinese government and by these Chinese companies. So a lot of concerns there. We really did want to address that because at Recorded Future, we are a security intelligence company. We don't just focus on cyber threats, but we also focus on geopolitical issues around the world. And I think the decline of democracy is one of the most concerning trends that we've seen. And China is one of the biggest influencers in the world right now, turning authoritarian style governments more towards their communist, Chinese style of socialism, as they say.
So, yeah, Chinese style communism, which is still communism, by the way, to anyone wondering what that is. It's still communism. You talked about their influence on media in South America. One thing that I didn't see in the report, and maybe you'd be able to, kind of help clarify that, is their influence with the media more in that they're buying into these companies and really starting to control the narrative of the writers, or is it more along the lines of they're just in there and really kind of doing social engineering and social influence?
Yeah, well, that's a really good point. I'm glad you brought this up. Influence operations are really tricky. So sometimes it's very hard to get attribution on where a certain story started or, how this narrative is being spread around the world. China and Russia are two of the best in the world at this, I'd say, tactic. And one of the ways they're doing it in Latin America and South America is through the political and technological influence. By building those types of relationships with authoritarian leaders, they're emphasizing the importance of censorship and surveillance in the media too. So, many of these countries are monitoring how their citizens are using the internet. They're restricting their use of certain applications and certain Western media. And then even more, China has state-sponsored media. They are in Western social media platforms as well. And they're pushing these pro-China narratives into foreign media as well. So that's the main observation we've had recently. And they've had a relative level of success because nobody's really countering it.
So it's very hard to counter that, is the feedback I often get when we talk about this, right, behind closed doors or with our peers and whatnot. We often hear how difficult that is for a lot of organizations to really go about it.
Yeah.
Part of it is because, like I said, China has no problem bribing someone to do a deal. In the US, if I'm an organization, if I'm any organization that does any business in the Western Hemisphere, right, going to bribe someone is an actual crime that I can go to jail for. So there's the, it's very hard to compete when the playing field isn't level.
Yeah. Well, just to be clear, I'm not saying you're wrong, but I didn't put anything about bribing in this report.
I know.
But the debt trap diplomacy aspect of some of these BRI and Digital Silk Road projects is really important to pay attention to. Some of these very poor nations that have no experience in information security are accepting very large loans from the Chinese government that they oftentimes are not able to pay back, like we pointed out earlier. Some of them have had critical infrastructure in their own countries confiscated by the Chinese government as a result. That is a huge concern. So call it bribery. We'll offer you 5G. We'll offer you connectivity the rest of the world. We'll give you an opportunity for jobs and technology and advancement. Yes, you get that. But what do you have to pay in the end?
In your report, did you see any resistance kind of some of these as fail stories where the Chinese does do that kind of impact maybe the thinking of others who are considering to do business that way? And are we seeing any sort of shift? I know that's not in the report, and I'm kind of asking you a very rhetorical out-of-report question. And if you don't know the data, that's okay. But I'm wondering, as other African leaders kind of see China behave that way to someone specifically, are they going like, you know what, maybe we don't want this? Hey, Germany, France, America, Italy, we're open. We're willing to play by the rules.
I sincerely hope that this report and others like it out there are helping to open the eyes of some of the leaders in those areas. But what it comes down to is they're accountable for the success of their country and the happiness of their people sometimes. And a lot of the demand is we want more connectivity. We want faster internet. We want to be able to work remote jobs the way the rest of the world is. So at the end of the day, when they're weighing their risks, I think many of them are willing to take the risk of going with China and Chinese technology. But we're trying to open their eyes to see more of, hey, this is not just a security risk. This could risk your entire economy and the privacy of your people in the long run. So, it's hard to look at the big picture and go, okay, we're going to hold off, because honestly, if other countries and their technology companies don't offer an affordable alternative, they're going to keep going to China for the cheapest price on this technology.
Right, and we know that there's several economies who can produce goods just as fast and just as good and at the same rate as China, and they're allies. Right, India's one, Pakistan's another, Bangladesh. I can keep going. Thailand, Vietnam. I can keep going. There's a slew of countries who can replace China and really help counteract some of their influence and power if need be, if someone just pulls the trigger there.
Many of those that you listed off, though, do have business relationships with Chinese technology companies already.
Correct.
So some of them are already reliant on Chinese connectivity. So that creates a complicated business situation, unfortunately.
Right. There were some, we won't get into that because there's I have a whole opinion on how things got screwed up, because we had a pretty decent China policy by President Obama. He had a strategy that, had it maybe continued a little bit more, might have put us in a different position today, and that might have been one of his better foreign policy decisions at the time.
Yeah. You asked earlier too, what about situations where these types of attempts failed? There was one case study in the report about Papua New Guinea. They have a very close relationship with Australia as well.
Right.
They accepted, like a technology internet package from a Chinese company. I believe it was Huawei. I would have to refer back to that particular case study. But what they discovered is through a security audit, they discovered that all of the infrastructure from the bottom up was created with critical vulnerabilities and just these wide security gaps. And it seemed like what Australia determined was that it was built like that by design. So that is very concerning that they feel maybe they didn't pay attention to security like what they claimed, like it was an honest mistake. But Australian security authorities determined that it was built like that by design in order to have an avenue for espionage and, basically siphoning out that data from one government to theirs.
We know that the CIS, the Chinese intelligence services, right? They are very much active in a lot of these tech companies that are out there selling this infrastructure, and they're very much involved in some of the influence stuff. Do you think that, based on what you just said, where you're looking at inherent vulnerabilities within the technology, that they're also almost not only doing it intentionally, but they're also looking to take advantage of foreign relationships within those specific countries to gain more espionage? So Papua New Guinea, we know that is big for Australia, because that's where all migrants that come into Australia illegally end up going into Papua New Guinea to get processed before they're even allowed into Australia if their claims are accepted. There's some geopolitical stuff that goes on there. Do you see that as kind of being a bit more of a, not only are we going to sell you technology that has vulnerabilities in it to begin with so we can have access, but we're also going to go to Papua New Guinea because we know it's strategically important for Australia. It's a strategic Australian relationship.
Exactly. I think that there is a likelihood that some of this is intentional and planned out from the top down. We don't have hard evidence. We can't say 100%. But if you look at the situation with how much effort they put into cyber espionage to break into and conduct intrusions into foreign networks and technology, seems like this would be an easier route. So there is a high likelihood that it is intentional, especially when we see it become a pattern. In many of these different case studies, the technology was built from the ground up with inherent security vulnerabilities, where it just left that organization or country wide open, or with direct access for Beijing to siphon out that data and to spy on those organizations.
So speaking of Beijing, next year they host the Winter Olympics, right?
Yes.
150 countries participate in the Winter Olympics, more or less. Press from all over the world. It is literally their big experiment for mass surveillance. Talk a little bit about what your report found on how they're getting ready for Beijing 2022 and why we should probably boycott those games altogether.
I don't think we addressed that in this particular report directly, but we are preparing, to really dig in deep on what the risks are and prepare risk assessments for all of our clients. Of course, we'll probably put out like a public-facing piece on this as well. And I do predict that many countries, many organizations, and many of the athletes are going to have severe restrictions on what they're allowed to do, what kind of technology they're allowed to take in, and they'll probably be briefed on espionage threats and surveillance threats.
Yeah, but the Winter Olympics to me seem like a very very essentially volunteering to be part of a greater experiment where they start to test their facial recognition technology really across the entire ecosystem of people who come in, where they get to test their ability to surveil someone's entire activities throughout the entire state, including user behavior analytics, there's just so much data that they're going to get out of this. It's really going to be mind-boggling.
I would expect that from the CCP, but I also already expect that they're doing that kind of activity already within their own country. So right now, what we're going to be focused on is influence operations. It's all pro-China. They're already, as soon as the Tokyo Olympics ended last week, they started pushing, Beijing 2022, happy, everything's going to be clean, everything's going to be perfect, we're going to be the perfect host. It's all very happy-go-lucky pro-China narratives right now. And so we expect that kind of influence operation to carry through to next year leading up to the games. And they're going to be trying to counter any, criticism, accusations of human rights issues. The US, Canada, UK, and Australia have been speaking out very harshly against, crackdowns on pro-democracy movements in China. So they'll be continuing to counter that. I would say we also have to be on the lookout for intrusion activity targeting the Five Eyes countries, to kind of collect information about what's going to happen leading up to the Olympics, because that's the way they assess their risks.
Let's talk a little bit about their exploits for IoT devices. So China's the #1 manufacturer in the world of IoT devices. They're selling those at cutting edge pieces. They're putting them in every single infrastructure they could possibly get their hands on. And then they're not only building the devices, they're also building the exploits for them, hoping that it gives them access. What are some of the things that your report found on that, and what's some of the conclusions that came out of that?
Man, I think one of the most, I don't like to be a fear monger, but this research was very heavy. We were looking at Chinese technology around the world, from user level IoT devices all the way up to 5G and satellites. So this section on the Internet of Things and their market penetration was a little frightening to me to realize how much data they have access to, not only at a network and server level, but also at a user level. Some of our findings were that they can access IoT data in 5 primary ways. At the user level, Chinese companies can access the data from sales and use of their IoT products, including very abusive terms of service. So oftentimes, if you're downloading an application from your app store on your phone, you may not be reading the fine print in the terms of service, like TikTok, for example, and they have access to all kinds of behavior data, monitoring your health information that's stored on your iPhone, even collecting information about the networks that you connect to. Another was device level, through manufacturing and design vulnerabilities. So inherently vulnerable devices created in China. At the corporate level, Chinese companies can acquire foreign IoT companies, which then gives them access to all of the data that company had. We've seen China buying out, chip technology companies around the world, especially in Europe, Israel, UK. And then another level of concern is around how the Chinese government has legal rights to subpoena private data at will from foreign businesses that operate in China. That's, the cybersecurity law of China. We're very concerned about that as well, which has been addressed recently. We don't want the Chinese government to be able to, just go to a foreign or American company and say, hey, we need access to this server. They don't have to provide any kind of legal documentation to be able to do that. And then, of course, big picture, the collection of user data, human behavior, device information from Chinese-made applications across the world, including social media, video games, IoT firmware, and business software. So those are our 5 main concerns when it comes to IoT.
Yeah, that's Whew, that's
I've never seen you so quiet.
so it's not stuff that maybe we didn't know, right? Like, let's be honest, we know China doesn't surprise anyone with its activity, but it's the pace by which they move forward that I think catches people off guard. Meaning,
Yeah.
go away for a month and come back, and all of a sudden you're like, "Whoa!" I'll tell you something very interesting. I lived in Israel for 5 years. That's where I met my awesome wife, and we were in Israel over the summer just a few months ago, right? And in my entire time in Israel, I've never seen channels with Chinese movies on them. But now every cable provider in Israel, both Yes and Hot, have 2 or 3 Chinese channels with Chinese entertainment on them.
Okay. Question. Are they trying to tailor programming to like Chinese diaspora and immigrants from China or Taiwan, or
In Israel?
are they trying to implement? Yeah, right. Are they trying to implement an avenue of influence in Israel? What do you think?
I think it's the latter. So China, there were 2 big things that China did in Israel. One is they bought Israel's dairy company, Tnuva. And Tnuva in Israel was one of the largest dairy manufacturers in all of Israel, right? They do like cottage cheese, white cheese, you name it, milk, you name it, they do it, right? And they bought Tnuva, which at the time was for a lot of money, I think like $1.5 billion, which was a lot of money. And they bought it, they said, for the technology, because of the way Tnuva was able to use the dairy farmers in Israel and the technology that they developed to really keep fresh dairy, because dairy wasn't very common in China.
Yeah.
Dairy is not a very common dietary item to eat, but they were trying to get dairy into the Chinese population for food security.
Yeah.
Right?
You know, when I learned Chinese, my teachers didn't even know a word for cheese.
Yeah, because cheese doesn't exist in China. That's not
cheese.
What is this cheese? What do you mean cheese, right?
It's the best food in the whole world. American.
It's only single-handedly the best compliment to a good glass of red wine or white wine, right? Is cheese. But if you take that, that's one. And then the second one was their attempt to buy 50% of the port of Haifa, where you were in the army, but I don't need to tell you that most of our naval ships in their journey to any Middle East deployment make a stop and some joint drills with Israel, and most of that is done in the port of Haifa.
Yes.
And that was significant. Netanyahu blocked that sale on national security. What they ended up doing is leasing a part of the port to a Chinese company, but not allowing them to gain equity or any sort of control over the port.
Yeah.
So that was kind of how he navigated that, and that was a lot of pressure at the time by President Trump and Secretary Pompeo on Israel, saying, if you guys do this, then we're no longer going to put our naval ships in Haifa, and then your stop will be over. We'll just stop in Cyprus and continue on. Like, any joint drills will be done outside of Israeli territorial waters, which was really critical for Israel and the U.S. for a bunch of different security reasons, to do a lot of these drills in Israeli territorial waters as well. So those were some of the influence I saw there.
Yeah, that's interesting. I haven't been in Israel in a couple of years. I didn't notice a large presence of possibly Chinese immigrants or people visiting from China. So that's why I asked about the television program and what you thought it might be.
So there's some pre-COVID, there was an increase of Chinese tourism to Israel. But obviously we know that religion is illegal in China. You're really not allowed. Your faith is the CCP, right? You worship Xi Jinping almost, right?
Yeah.
Churches, synagogues, mosques aren't really.
They allow a presence of some religious organizations, but they have tight control over what they can teach and what they cannot teach and what their holy books can say.
Correct. And so the traditional tourism to Israel is typically always around religion, right? People want to go to Jerusalem, they want to go to Nazareth, they want to go to Bethlehem, they want to kind of do the Christianity tour, and then there's the Jews that want to go do the Jewish tour, and there's the Muslims that want to go do the Muslim tour. Chinese tourists predominantly come for tech and some religion, but they have their own little thing. And over the years pre-COVID, there were about 3 or 4 flights a day from Ben Gurion directly to Shanghai and Beijing and Guangzhou and Hong Kong. I think it was like 8 or 9 flights a day that were going from Israel to China pre-COVID. So I think there was a significant amount of trade, and with Chinese really showing a lot of interest in Israeli technology, which was a concern.
Yeah, absolutely. And, I think something really timely to point out right now on the topic of influence around the world is that we have to be careful as security practitioners to differentiate. And I'm not talking necessarily to you, James, but to the audience, especially we as Americans, we have to be careful to differentiate Chinese citizens and people from the Chinese government. Indeed. Because just like we don't all subscribe to the government that is running us at some point in time, oftentimes the Chinese people are just subjects of their government. And with the rise in hate crimes going on in America and around the world, I think it's really important to just, point out that we have to be diligent and not discriminating against Asians and Asian Americans because of their heritage or the way their government operates. Just wanted to throw that in there for all. Chinese there.
So I preface that in anything I say. I love, and I have many friends in mainland China and Hong Kong that are of Chinese origin. They're my friends. There are people who, if someone called me tomorrow and said, I need X, I'd probably drop everything and help that person.
Yes.
Kind of friends I've got. I don't agree with the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, and the Chinese government.
And that's something that in our research, we've been really diligent about changing our rhetoric to be more careful, to point out that this is China-based campaign or CCP-sponsored campaign, just to be very specific about who the threat is so that we're not adding to the harmful rhetoric that so often more ignorant people will pick up on and be like, oh.
Yeah, I think I wouldn't say ignorant. I'd say people who are not educated or just simply stick to a headline or a narrative rather than do research, right? Yeah. There's an aspect to what you just said that I think you nailed it on the head, right? Which is if you understand and you do a little bit of research, you know that in China, every block in China has a CCP office on it. And there's a CCP officer, Chinese Communist Party officer. And that officer is essentially in charge of feeling the dissent in that block and dealing with it, meaning in the event that there are people who are unhappy with the government and are displeased with it, then they end up going and really quashing that at the beginning. And that's done in every city and every city block in China. That's very, very common. So the people of China are essentially victims of that system. They can't freely express themselves, even if they're unhappy. And when they're traveling abroad, they're closely monitored, they're debriefed, right? They don't know who on their trip is a CCP plant. And so they can't even partially express themselves. I remember someone once telling me in Italy, they found a note after a group from China left the hotel and it said, help us, we're trapped in a hotel in Rome. And so
that's really interesting. I didn't know that about the block police officers. I have talked to some Chinese citizens who've said we value security over privacy. And that's part of our culture that we've been raised with. Just like Americans value privacy more than security sometimes. And I try to respect the cultural differences and understand that, hey, maybe our way of doing things is not right for everyone, but we will work to protect people's privacy and security both all over the world.
True. Just because we have democracy doesn't mean everyone needs to, necessarily have our style of democracy. Democracy has many faces and methods of doing it. But what's really important is to understand the freedom of the people to be able to express themselves.
Yes, especially
freely.
if they're being harmed,
Correct.
being targeted as minorities or religious groups. Absolutely. That's why we do our job.
Indeed. Charity, thank you so much for coming with me and spending this Friday and this hour with me. This was so awesome and so insightful, and I hope
always awesome to talk to you, James.
It's always awesome to have you, and then I'll have Charity back on for Veteran November, November. So everyone should know that on Veterans Day, November 11th, I'll be doing a streaming telethon fundraiser for the Wounded Warrior Project. We'll be inviting different people on for 15, 20, 30-minute blocks. You'll be bringing people in to fundraise. We're going to be raising money for the Wounded Warrior Project to take care of the men and women who are now coming home from Afghanistan and after long deployments who need support. And the Wounded Warrior Project needs the financial help so that they can take in all these young men and women who need help from being in the battlefield for so long, and getting them the opportunities, including the mental and physical therapy that they need in order to join people like myself and Charity, who have had the, we've had, I would say we've had the luck of transitioning into some sort of civilian normal lifestyle. Many of our colleagues and brothers and sisters did not.
I want to add to, if you're a veteran out there and you're listening right now and you are feeling really distraught over what's happening in Afghanistan, just know that you're not alone. Please don't give up. And if you do feel alone, reach out to us. Let us know. Yeah. Even if you just want to chat and talk, I'm available. So just want to put that out there.
Yeah. So Veteran November, the entire month of November, every day I'll be putting out an episode a day with veterans who are in security. We're going to highlight 30 veterans this year. I've got some new faces and I'm bringing some old ones. But on November 11th, from essentially 9 a.m. to 9 p.m., I'll be live streaming all day with different guests coming on, and we'll be raising money for Wounded Warrior. And we'll bring on veterans, people from Wounded Warrior, whose Wounded Warrior project has helped them in recover, or got them into a job, or got them to start a business, or help them live a normal life after a severe injury, whether it be physical or mental, because some people come back looking just like me and Charity, but they still have an injury that needs to be dealt with.
Yes.
And so please consider supporting that. I'll be bringing out more announcements of that over the next 2 to 3 weeks, and we'll start lining up some guests and people to come on. That's November 11th. That's 3 months from 2 days ago. But it's Veterans Day. And so we'll be supporting the Wounded Warrior Project this year as well as putting out all the awesome content. It's how I met Charity, was Veteran November, and so
I can't wait.
It's going to be awesome this year, and I'm gonna have a very ambitious fundraiser, by the way, folks. So this isn't a $5,000 or $10,000 fundraiser, but I will set up milestones, and I will wear paisleys, and I will. You guys know every third Friday. So next week, Alan Alford will be with me. I will have a really good set of hats as well. So you guys can also have a good time while we do it and get a lot of perks from it as well. So thank you, LaMarcus, for your comment. Appreciate it. Thank you, Larry. Wounded Warrior is an absolute awesome organization. And he also says no pizza in China. Cross them off the trail.
I am sure there is now, but when I learned Chinese, I did not know the word for cheese.
Yeah, and they did not know how, and pizza's universal at this point. Folks, Charity Wright, you guys can follow her on LinkedIn. Charity Wright, are you on Twitter as well?
Yes, Twitter, Charity W4 CTI.
Awesome. Folks, that's it for us here. Have a great weekend. Until next time, thank you so much for watching. Thank you for being here. See you. Stay safe, guys. Bye.
Bye.
Make sure to subscribe to our podcast and share it with your friends and colleagues. And get all the latest information at cyberhubpodcast.com.